on opportunities and challenges of artificial intelligence in auditing. We're joined by a group of esteemed experts that include Ed Abuz, co-founder of C3AI, Will Bible, digital transformation and innovation leader at Deloitte, Chris Vanetti, founder and CEO of Hudson Labs, Himesh McLester, founder and CEO of Transparently AI, Valerie Nikolov, professor of accounting at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Tracy Harris of the IG will be moderating the discussion. We have provided detailed bios of each panelist with you all and look forward to the discussion. With that, I will give the floor to Tracy. Tracy, please take it away.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here to talk about AI. I want to level set because a lot of people may not know exactly what AI is. So I wanted to start off with Valerie, and maybe you could kind of set the table for us on talking about AI and the different types of AI that's available right now. And we can move forward with kind of, once we do that, how it's being implemented in organizations.
Right. Well, sounds good. Let me try. So, one way to put it is that we are basically living through a revolution in technological space. And the key element of this revolution is the emergence of large language models, which essentially allow allow machines to communicate like a human, right? And so you can kind of ask questions and get answers about whatever areas you might be interested in, including financial reporting. And, I ask sometimes complicated accounting questions that I don't quite understand and get pretty meaningful answers. It is transforming, society and the economy at many fundamental levels, and generates a lot of challenges and also a lot of opportunities, business opportunities, and also academic opportunities to do research, because it opens a lot of questions, right? So this is something that I've been taking advantage of in my research, and in particular, I'm interested in questions like, will this development, right, the emergence of generative AI, help investors process a large quantity of complex financial documents? Will it facilitate decision making by outside investors or by insiders within the firm? Will AI help us make financial markets more efficient, all right, and level the informational playing field across different investor groups? Or will we kind of end up in a situation where we all rely on kind of the same model, and we end up in a situation where it gets it wrong, and then we're in the next financial crisis, right? These are all very interesting questions and important questions. I mean, more specifically to this current topic, one of the key questions that academics would be interested in is how can AI facilitate oversight of financial reporting, right? And how can it improve the quality of financial reporting? So these are the questions. I have a number of papers, and you can kind of find them if you go to my website. But basically, I can tell you a little bit, maybe a couple minutes about what we do, right? So one of the first papers we wrote is basically about...
Larry, yep. Can I interrupt for one quick second? I want to give everybody a clear understanding of what AI is, because there are different types. Could you kind of walk us through that first?
Well, so AI, I think, is not a very well-defined term, right? It's a very kind of old term in the sense that, I mean, most people kind of became aware of AI and this kind of technological revolution with the launch of ChatGPT by OpenAI, right? But AI basically refers to anything that involves machine learning, right? And ultimately, machines helping us making decisions. So there are different types of machine learning models, but the most advanced ones that currently people basically use and that underlie the large language models as well, these are so-called neural networks, right? And so these are kind of complex models that essentially allow you to kind of make very, they sort of have an analogy with human brains, right? How they process information. It's a rough analogy, but basically, they can process information very efficiently, and then they can allow you to make decisions, to identify, certain patterns in, say, images, identify, diseases, for example, and so on. So, then now a lot of people are talking about generative AI, right? And generative AI is essentially, similar type of technology, but involves sort of model generating output, right? So in case of language, that's basically text, right? And so it's kind of very important to understand, have some understanding of how this large language models work, right? Essentially, they are trained to predict text based on the context that you give to the model. And so that's why context is very important, because, if you don't give the right context, the model will continue generating some random kind of hallucinated text, which is not going to be useful at all. But with the right context, the model will give you very good summaries of financial documents and so on. I don't know if
Thanks.
this is what you're looking for. Yeah.
Sure. Can you kind of walk us through how AI is being implemented in organizations and what the kind of basic foundation needs to be for it to be successfully implemented?
Yeah, Tracy, I think that was directed to me. Is that
Yes.
correct? Yeah, happy to do so. And so C3AI is an AI applications company. And I'll just explain the context in which we're deployed. So if you look at the systems that companies use today, they're very good at they're tracking systems. So they can tell you exactly how much cash you have, where your inventory is, who your customers are, and then maybe over the past, customers that have churned, etc. What we do with AI is basically implement it on top of those existing systems and make them predictive in nature. So the questions that we can start to answer now is, how much cash am I going to need in order to run my operation? How much inventory do I need to have in order to satisfy customer orders? And then which customer is likely to churn? All of this predicting kind of the future, if you will, allows companies to operate more effectively, because they can then take action and change the course of the future. So we've implemented these types of systems in manufacturing companies, for example, like Koch Industries, to anticipate failure of equipment so that they can maintain them on a scheduled basis and obviously not experience non-productive time. Same thing in oil and gas. Companies like Shell and Exxon are using these technologies to optimize yield. And companies like Cargill, for example, in their supply chain, to more efficiently move, order of 100 billion in food from where it's grown to where it's needed. So these are examples. In banks, you were using these techniques and technologies to anticipate or to pinpoint financial crimes, maybe anti-money laundering, etc. So these are the types of use cases. Just a word on generative AI. So generative, as popularized by ChatGPT, does provide a very simple interface. So rather than having to train everybody on an application, people can now just use a Google-like search interface to type in a question, and then the system is navigating all the underlying systems to basically retrieve an answer. So think about it as a step function change in an application interface. I'll pause there, Tracy.
Sure, sure. Well, we talked about AI and its use in audit. Can you give us a better understanding of how firms will be using AI in the audit process going forward, and how that will hopefully make for more resilient audits and also increase accuracy and efficiency within the audit process?
Sure. There's a lot to that question. So I think just to build off what Ed was talking about, there really are in this context the different classes of artificial intelligence. One is artificial intelligence that you train on data that you have using machine learning. That requires a large amount of information to do effectively, and I think that's why Ed was pointing out that you have to have these transactional systems in place. Then there's the models behind ChatGPT, the large language models. Those really, the key pivotal thing is that they are pre-trained models. They come already trained on large bodies of information, and in this case, literature. And they do a great job of kind of transferring words from one context to another. So when we think about the audit process, and we think about what auditors do as a normal course of their service, there is a lot of reading and writing involved. Whether that's reading source documents, writing audit documentation, reviewing that documentation, using documents to reach conclusions. And so these GPT models, large language models, offer an opportunity to perhaps streamline, make more efficient drafting, reviewing, reading, extracting information in the context of that audit process. What we've found as we've been working with these over the last 18 months or so is that they provide a very nice first draft capability, I would call it, where they can help start a process that then an experienced professional can pick up and take to its penultimate conclusion in an audit process, but are very capable at scanning across large volumes of information and providing summaries, and with the right kind of software application can be beneficial in a wide variety of business processes, auditing included.
So, Chris, you have worked in AI for some time, and now you have your own models that you're deploying for investors. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're deploying AI in that area and what investors need to know when they're using that type of model?
Absolutely, happy to. I should also point out we don't just serve investors, we do also serve audit firms and accountants. So it's not just an investing tool, but we are a language modeling company that focuses on corporate disclosure. Do want to also point out that generative AI is talking about generative language models or generative large language models. Not all generative large language models need to be in a chatbot format. Not all generative language models even need to be used to generate text. You can also use them for tagging all sorts of things. And also, there are non-generative language models. There are language models that are not large. It is a very diverse and interesting field. So the question was about how we are deploying this for investors. So I'm going to give a very sort of both investor and accountant example. When you think about what language models have done for us as a society, they've made it possible for a computer to understand, in quotes, human language in a way that's much more real. So understanding content, context, and meaning. Not to the same degree of understanding as a human being. There are obviously limitations. But what that means is let's think about a situation where you are an investor and you want to assess related party risk across your entire portfolio, or assess related party risk across the entire subsector of electric vehicles. Right now, or in the past, the way you would do that is incredibly intensive. You'd have to open up every 10K and start searching for the related party disclosure. Some of it's going to be in 10Qs. Maybe they discuss some of it in earnings calls. You're going to be using search words. You're trying to pull that together. With a sophisticated language model, you can identify related party transactions regardless of how they've been disclosed. So it doesn't matter whether you're using the keyword related party, the keyword affiliate. If you're saying I sold my jet to my best friend, however that is phrased, the model, if trained correctly, can understand the true meaning of what that is. So we are able to tag, extract, and summarize that type of information across the entire population of US companies. You can imagine how valuable that is, not just to investors, but also audit firms who are now able to see that across the entire population. Up until very recently, it was not possible to understand the frequency of internal control weaknesses and deficiencies across the entire US population. Now I can tell you which audit firms have the highest proportion of public companies with active material control weaknesses right now, because our systems update in real time. We have information not just about what the active material control weaknesses is as a summary for that company, but also can create reliable stats across the entire population.
And Chris, can you talk a little bit more about? Can you talk a little bit more about the data underlying that model and how you gather that data? Because I think, most people think of AI as something big and unwieldy, which it is. And so we want to try to get to a point where we can understand what's feeding this algorithm, what's feeding this model, why is it useful for investors as well as auditors?
So the end product is a data set of this company has an active material control weakness, is remediated or not. Here's a summary of it with all of the core items.
But how do you gather that data?
How do we, getting there. So we plug in directly to Edgar, more or less.
Okay.
We have an SEC API. And the back end is actually very complicated. And I think that's the XBRL data tagging is a great question, helpful, but not core to our process. We are looking at the narrative aspects of the document. So our process works with PDFs that have been converted to text as well. But it's very different, our process, than just a straight chatbot. We are using models that are very, very similar to the back end of ChatGPT, but in a much more controlled environment. So when we're getting a 10K, it's going through a long process that involves multiple language models, some of which are generative, some of which are not, some of which are large, some of which are not. We're doing noise suppression, we're doing tagging. So that's one of the things that you can do using AI models, is identify what is this related to. We have specialized financial models that are trained on lots of SEC filings, so they know what a related party is. For instance, if you go and talk to ChatGPT and ask it what a critical audit matter is, it has no idea. It will tell you the wrong thing. So we need to use specialized models that understand our language. So we do tagging, we do relevance ranking, and we have a very long process that finally also results in a summary component that is the generative aspect, but that process is very controlled in order to maintain factuality. Sorry, did that answer your question, Tracy?
No, that's very helpful. Hamish, can you tell us a little bit more about your organization and how it impacts and uses AI?
Sure. Look, thank you very much, Tracy. So we take a slightly different perspective from the discussion so far in terms of things like LLMs and generative AI. So we offer, as far as we can tell, a completely unique solution, which is for fully automated AI forensic accounting. So we have a system that's designed to find the next Enron, the next Wirecard, And it does so on average 2 to 3 years in advance of public knowledge of the problems in that company. So the system explicitly quantifies the likelihood a company is manipulating its accounts, how seriously it's doing so, and whether it's likely to collapse as a result. And then the killer app of the process is it generates fully automated forensic accounting reports. These run anywhere from 10 to 50 pages long, generated for any company in our system. And these forensic accounting reports are built in literally 2 to 3 seconds. So the clients using these include one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, top 10 global bank, and a global contract with one of the big 4 auditors. And to put it in context, right now today, we can see 79 companies listed in the US right now with a market cap over $1 billion US with a rating of F in our system. And to put that, and that's a range of A+ to F. So to put that in context, that's wirecard levels of manipulation and potentially outright fraud. So in other words, we can see 79 companies where every single one of those, and these are big companies, there's lots of other smaller and mid-tier ones, but every single one of those is almost certainly going to result in a very expensive and embarrassing lawsuit for the auditors involved. And separately, again, to put this in context, we employed our system to actually rank auditors by the extent to which their clients appear to be engaged in accounting manipulation. Now, for other obvious reasons, we have not published that research, but for example, we can see in the US right now that a disproportionate amount of the companies engaged in accounting manipulation, they are audited by 3 auditors, one of which is a member of the Big 4. So, we have a variety of use cases for our technology in the banking, asset management, regulatory, exchange world, but not least, one of our key channels is, of course, auditors.
So with your proprietary software, what data are you analyzing? Are you looking at 10Ks? What are you looking at to feed your model?
Yeah, effectively, we're ingesting all of the published accounts by companies. So in other words, the system at this stage is constrained to publicly listed companies, but we effectively cover all publicly listed companies globally, alive or dead, listed anytime since the early 1990s. So there's about 85,000 companies in the system covering every market globally. We're ingesting all of, as I say, the published accounting data for those. And that's kind of one of the remarkable parts of this, that people ask us, well, how can you do this? Because these are audited accounts, and this is high level. We don't have access to the general ledger. Remarkable thing is you can with an incredibly high level of accuracy. On top of that, we are currently engaged in a project to actually extend this to something called privacy protected federated computation that would create a data ingestion engine whereby auditors, for example, or any one of our clients could take their own proprietary data for private companies and inject those into our system in a privacy protected way, so we don't have access to their data, it's all secure, but to actually get explicit accounting manipulation risk signals out.
Interesting. So, Will, as we go back to the accounting uses of AI, and we're thinking about upcoming audits and how to effectively utilize AI in an audit scenario, can you walk through kind of what you think that process should look like?
Sure. Look, from our process, from our point of view, in terms of the product that we offer, there's a few different points in the audit process. The rather obvious one is, for a start, audit quality, so audit assurance. So the audit assurance team, and this is, for example, how one of the Big 4 auditors is using our technology, can use it to assess where, for example, in their book of audit clients, they have exposure. If they're looking at it from a global perspective, what countries, what sectors, but they can even zoom down to individual clusters or factors of characteristics. So, for example, potentially they have a variety of clients engaged in similar levels, similar types of manipulation, because our system is very importantly explainable AI. It gives you very clear direction as to where the manipulation is coming from. Typically, we would advise that it's also used in the early phases of the audit process to establish whether there are particular risk issues with a company, because our automated forensic reports will direct the auditor to where in particular to focus their limited time and attention. Also, very importantly, client onboarding. is another area, and of course consulting opportunities. Given our system is essentially flagging companies with problems, it's not like an activist short seller where you announce and it suddenly collapses the next day. It's giving you, on average, as I mentioned before, 2 to 3 years advanced knowledge that this is a company engaged in serious manipulation. So there are serious consulting opportunities for auditors to work with the client to actually turn the problem around.
Will, we had talked about you using AI as a tool for auditing, and I think Chris was also in that conversation, and looking at it as more of a software, not necessarily a decision maker. Can you talk a little bit more to the PCAOB and the IAG about what you think the role of AI will be as it relates to you all moving forward and using it throughout audit?
Yeah, no, happy to do that. I think what we've talked about has illustrated that AI, in particular generative AI, is more than a chatbot, and it can be built into business processes where it can accelerate, expand, extend those business processes. But like Chris mentioned, if you ask the large language models today what a critical audit matter is, it may fail miserably. And there are numerous examples of where that is the case, and that's fine. So we can't expect that an AI model has perfection. And so the way that we think about deploying those technologies is like any other technology, where it's an enabler for the professional who's doing the work to do that work better. But we think that maintaining the quality control over that work is paramount. So in an audit process, you have standards of supervision and review, where key judgments, conclusions, documentation, the evidence is reviewed by the auditor, is both prepared by a trained accountant and then reviewed and then potentially reviewed by multiple levels. And if a preparer of that documentation does use an AI tool to assist in that preparation, it still needs to go through those different reviews, including a self-review by the preparer, to make sure there's not a flaw in the software application. We do extensive testing before we put out software for our auditors to consume to try to get it to as accurate as we possibly can. But in the world of AI-based solutions, you are dealing with probabilistic technologies, and you can't code for every single possible circumstance that you're going to encounter. And so you can't predict where it might go wrong. So that self-review is absolutely critical.
And so are you looking at data sets for a particular industry or company when you come in and you try to utilize an AI model on top of that? Or are you looking at the entire universe of firms in this particular industry? How do you even decide? And is there more than one AI model for different industries? Or, I think we're talking about it in a way that it's so general, nobody can really grasp the intensity of it and the specificity of it, and so it's a little amorphous at this point still.
Yeah. So there's multiple, let's call it multiple applications of AI.
Okay.
And those applications may string together multiple models to achieve a purpose. So if you think of an audit process, a very standard audit process is a test of details. So that's making a selection from a ledger, picking those items, and going to get sufficient appropriate audit evidence to validate the different assertions associated with those items. And typically what an auditor would do is make the selection, go gather the evidence, look at them, evaluate, et cetera. We can deploy an AI model to look at that evidence first, perhaps summarize it, extract the information from that evidence, and populate a table. And so then the auditor needs to look at that table and now look at the evidence, but doesn't have to manually key those things in. Whereas in the past, there was kind of a data transfer element of that process. So that's an application.
Okay.
The other application of risk assessment, which is what Hamish was just talking about, is using publicly available information to try to build, in most cases, multivariate regression models to predict and score companies based on their potential failure rates. In that case, you're looking at entire populations of data. So there's multiple applications here, and I think that we're just starting for seeing those put into place.
How can we rely on the accuracy of these models in audit? How can we know that this information can handle complex data and interpret real results?
Yeah.
And that's for everybody. So please chime in.
I'll take as the auditor, I'll take the first one.
Okay.
So, you know, the answer to that is you check it. So the audit process requires you to obtain sufficient, reliable, relevant audit evidence. And no matter what the AI model puts out, you do have something to check it against. And so I think the idea that we would ask a chatbot a question or put in place an AI model and then just accept that without any verification of fact would not be following, you know, the audit standards that we put in place.
Do you think that this will impact audit standards? And then I'll get to you, Hamish.
That remains to be seen. I know there's an active dialogue about it. And I think that the general conceptual standards are in place to execute, you know, audits. I think that there could be some interesting application guidance around how to audit probabilistic systems when our clients adopt this technology into their own financial reporting and accounting. It does start to pose some interesting questions around internal controls and systematic controls and automated controls. I see lots of hands going up, so I will stop.
Okay, I'll take Hamish next.
Very much. Look, it's a great question, but not least because AI systems and tools, while yes, they can be very powerful, they have this kind of black boxy perception, which I think is, you know, coming out in some of your questions, Tracy, in terms of just how confusing and how amorphous this whole area can be. So, for example, with us, and I mentioned before, our system explicitly identifies accounting manipulation and how serious it is. We often get asked about false positives. That's the key, right? If our system's flagging a company, we want to make sure it is genuinely accurate. So we actually built into the process the minimization of false positives. So for, amongst other things, we provide a score of 0 to 100%, which is a joint probability. A few people have already talked about probabilities. Yeah, a lot of AI is about probability. So it's a joint probability of manipulation, its seriousness, and whether the company is likely to outright collapse as a result. So to put it in context, in terms of accuracy, our out of sample testing, and obviously this is not the forum to start going into econometrics and statistics, etc. But if we sat here today and used our system to identify a basket of companies with a score of say 80% plus, then we know with a very high level of certainty, if we come back again in a couple of years' time to review those companies, because remember I said our system provided very early warning, we would see 90 to 95% of those companies either no longer exist or be a shadow of their former selves. So it is actually possible to create an AI accounting system that provides an exceptionally high degree of accuracy regarding the signals.
Thank you, Hamish. Chris?
Thank you. I wanted to honor your statement about this being an amorphous conversation. And I think one of the reasons for that is that AI is a very broad field and poorly defined. But want to take it back to something a bit more simplistic. We're talking about AI as a future thing or something that we're implementing now. And I just want to bring it back to the basics and remind you all that AI is already being used in audit. You are already using AI. You probably used AI today, not just AI, you probably use generative language models, very advanced language models. Anytime, if any of you use Outlook online version, when you type and you see auto suggest, that's generative AI, right? Do you remember in the olden days when you wanted to convert a PDF to text and it never worked very well and now it works really well? That is a different type of AI model that is really improving that process. So we are already integrating lots of AI models, including very advanced ones, into our day-to-day lives, often without recognizing it. Every time we use Google Translate, for instance. So it's not all complicated and scary. It really is a model that is, well, language models are taking human language and converting it into a vector embedding that represents meaning. And those mathematical vectors are being used for all sorts of things. And when it becomes dangerous, or dangerous isn't the right word, but risky to use AI models is when you use a model for something it's not well designed for. And in my personal opinion, a fully generative process or a pure chatbot functionality where you're relying on one single generative model is a very irresponsible way to build business applications in most areas. But I trust that most serious businesses are not approaching it that way.
Thank you for that, Ed.
Yeah, I build on what Chris and Hamish were saying. There are different types of AI and machine learning models, different techniques for to accomplish different objectives, if you will. And Chris was talking a little bit about these large language models, which basically are very good at interpreting questions and generating content. But you can also use them to interpret questions and limit their ability to just generate content, and basically have them go retrieve information from reliable or trustworthy sources. And so they don't, and then without that they do suffer the concept of that's referred to as hallucination, where they make stuff up. But you can turn that capability down, use them to interpret the question, and then actually go retrieve information from trusted sources, whether it's a ledger or a Edgar 10K filing, etc. And then have it traceable to specific. So when you get an answer, it basically tells you, I got the answer and I got it from this 10K, or I got this entry and I got it from this ledger. So there are ways of implementing these systems that provide what Hamish, I think, referred to as explainability. So you can explain, here's something that looks like high risk, and here's why. It's kind of an evidence package associated with it. Or here's the answer, and then here's where I got it from. So there are techniques to basically ensure that the recipient of a risk assessment, the recipient of an answer, can actually validate it against ground truth or evidence.
Thank you. Valerie?
Thank you. Let me just add that, it's very important to distinguish uses of AI where we use it as a support tool. And this is most of the time, like what Will was talking about, say, generating a report and then human takes over, right? Or, helping to summarize a complex document. Versus another possibility where we use AI kind of as a decision maker, right? And we are moving actively towards this state of the world where we will be able to use AI as a central decision maker in many applications, but we are not quite there yet. And it's very important to understand that AI inherently is limited in judgment and decision making, right? And this is why it's typically very important for humans, at least currently, to take over. And the reason is very simple, because a lot of very complex decisions, they don't really involve right and wrong answer. They basically involve trade-offs that only humans understand how to make, right? And so this is, where we shouldn't be comfortable like letting AI kind of make decisions for us, right? Whereas as a support tool, there's very little risk involved, I would say. Yeah. And maybe, very quickly, I'll add, on this issue of explainability, I think we actually made very significant steps with the generative language modeling in terms of explainability, because this issue persisted for a very long time, right? Any machine learning application is a black box, but with the language modeling, you allow machine to communicate as a human, essentially, right? And you can basically get the answer from the machine. You like if it gives you a score, you can through a series of questions or prompts get the answer of why, provide rationale essentially why you think that performance is going to persist or decline. And yeah, this is something that I've written some research papers on, and yeah.
So the prompting in AI is critical to getting the kind of information that you want out of it, correct? Is that what you're saying,
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Prompting is important, but yeah.
How do you ask a more beautiful question to get the information and synthesize the information that you want?
Yeah, so like many of us sometimes go and ask ChatGPT something and we get very kind of unsatisfactory, not useful answer. If you're really good at formulating the prompt, you can get a lot more out of the model, more useful information, including, when you say, would like to get some useful information from a 10K, it's very important to formulate the prompt in a way that will, we have a project where we're trying to extract insights about non-quantitative complex risks that companies are facing, like, for instance, environmental risks. If you just ask the model, tell me about environmental risks, it's going to do a very kind of poor job, right? But if you formulate a prompt in a reasonably sophisticated way, explaining what you mean and kind of what information you're looking for, you get a beautiful summary that basically is pretty useful in many ways, yeah.
So if you all were to think about how best for the PCAOB to think about AI, what kind of advice or guidance do you think you would give the PCAOB and the IAG about the use and the risks of this type of a model? Chris?
I have this answer may sound self-serving, but I would like to first say that I have, I used to work in audit at KPMG, did a lot of SOX auditing, and very much believe that auditors are fairly conservative. And I think the biggest and most important problem to be tackled by the PCAOB and promoting the larger mission is making sure that technological innovation in this field happens. When I was first starting, there was not one. This was back in 2018, just as we were founding Hudson Labs. The reason for our founding, there was not one paper using the language model published in a reputable accounting or finance journal at that time, which is madness. We're talking about investors and stakeholders being able to use information. I find it absolutely shocking and concerning how many of our customers who are sophisticated institutional investors do not know what an internal control weakness is, don't know how it's different from a critical audit matter, do not know what a going concern warning is. We can use this technology. We need so much more innovation to build a system where stakeholders can consume this information. I know there's been a lot of concerns about audit quality. We need to be freeing up time so that audit partners and audit seniors can be making those really high-level judgmental decisions about risks that they need to be taking so they're not caught in the weeds. So I really do believe that the most important role for the PCAOB is facilitating innovation and trusting that we are as accountants, we are pretty conservative and unlikely to be the people bringing down the planet using irresponsible AI.
Ed, you had a comment?
Yeah, my advice there are at least a dozen places where you could apply AI, and that's quite typical in many of the companies and organizations that we engage. So whether it's and many of them have been mentioned here today, whether it's in risk assessment or, as Hamish pointed out, kind of predictive, using it in predictive cases, or fraud detection, continuous monitoring, and instead of periodic monitoring. whether it's quality control on audits and following, following the steps associated with an audit, et cetera. So there are myriad ways that you can harness AI. And my recommendation is get started. Pick one of these use cases that have been mentioned here, and these are deployable in short periods of time for reasonably small sums of money. So we typically get a system up and running in within 3 months, sometimes 6 months max. And it takes one of these functions, whether it's continuous monitoring or risk assessment, and deploys a system that can be used. And then basically once
I'm gonna interject one thing. When we last spoke, you have to have a system environment that this can sit above, that's fully integrated. How many organizations really have that full integration model where they can get all of their data in a similar format to the right place so it can utilize this AI model?
Yeah, and so I think Valerie said that context is important, and you get the context from information from multiple systems, whether it's Edgar and whether it's ledger entries, et cetera, filings. So one of the core capabilities that we happen to provide is the ability to take data from disparate systems, take documents, take structured data like ledger entries, filings, et cetera, and actually assemble all of that from the disparate systems to solve a specific problem. Now, that might sound daunting, but the way to approach is as I mentioned, which is start with one use case or application, as we mentioned, and assemble the data that's required to serve that particular application. And then once you've got that, then you can expand to the next application, and then the next by incrementally adding additional data sources from your underlying systems or filing systems, ledgers, et cetera. So part of the value comes from these models, the machine learning models that we've spoken about, but the context that you feed the models is kind of table stakes. So you need to provide context, and that comes from numerous systems, and the data formats are all different. You're right, but with the right software technology, basically what we're doing is we're taking data from these disparate systems and reconciling it is probably the right way to say that this is information from this company, even though it's coming from different systems with and different references to that same company. So that's a core component, and the more context you provide these models, the better they perform. But bottom line is start somewhere with one application for a set of companies, maybe in an industry, and then expand from there. Is the bottom line, Tracy?
Okay, thanks. Hamish?
Thanks so much. Look, I 100% agree with the comments that have come so far. I love Chris's comments about advocating and support coming from the PCAOB for the audit community to implement these sorts of solutions, because there will be significant education and assistance required. And obviously the PCAOB is incredibly well placed to take a leadership role in that space. I also love Ed's comments regarding, pick a few to start. Start somewhere, and some of these I take the point that some are difficult to implement, but others aren't. I'm sure that I'm guessing Chris's solution is similar to mine in the context that there's no implementation whatsoever. The data processing is already done. So for example, for our system, if you can type cat into Google, you can use our system. I mean, there's zero implementation because the data is all there. Essentially, we're providing you with the analytical tools to investigate that. But the one thing I would add on top of this is that also there are AI tools out there. And again, I back up Chris's comments about, certain things being self-serving, and clearly this is self-serving on my part, but there are tools out there that the PCAOB itself could be exploiting to understand audit quality risk. So audit assurance in the US, or in fact elsewhere, anywhere the PCAOB wants to look, but obviously principally the US, to understand actually inherent risks within the accounting community and the accounting system itself. And I think those are very, very important to consider, because there are potentially systemic risks there, but also identifying major problems that can be prevented.
Thanks. Valerie?
Thank you. I agree with all the comments, and particularly with that it's good to start somewhere. I think actually PCAOB is uniquely positioned to take advantage of language models and as a result improve the oversight of over financial reporting and the quality of financial reporting. And more specifically, I think, in fact, you don't necessarily need to go outside of PCAOB. You have, I understand, a team of people that utilize machine learning models or build machine learning models to detect risks of material misstatements and audit failures and so on, right? However, based on my limited interaction with this team, they are not currently using language models, right? And language models give you a vast untapped data that basically provides a lot of information potentially to detect, manipulations, as Hamish was saying, or detect risks of misstatements. This can come from public domain, but the most interesting aspect of what PCAOB is uniquely positioned to do is actually to use their internal audit engagement level communications, right? So all this documentation, memos, and documents that summarize how the audit went and what happened and whether there were estimates and some material transactions, right? All that data has huge amount of very valuable information about whether there will be audit failure or not. So you can easily train a model on that data. You have a lot of that data, or fine-tune a bigger model, like, take a large language model, fine-tune a smaller model on top of it, so that you are able to detect with much higher accuracy than you currently have, instances where there may be fraud, or at least the risk of fraud, is high, right? And I'm very interested in the topic academically. I'm happy to offer any additional expertise or advice, if you ever want to take this initiative forward. But that would be my comments.
So, Will, you've been silent, and I want to get your input as an actual audit firm. What are your thoughts about this?
A couple of things. One, I think that most of the audit firms, have started, this journey in some form or fashion. It's not lost on the business community that these large language models offer a lot of opportunity to improve the overall quality of products and solutions and services. I think that there are some areas in particular with ICFR, as I mentioned, that issuers will start to run into questions about how they can potentially adopt artificial intelligence into internal control processes. And the audit profession as a whole needs to be able to respond to that question, because the way we've designed our audit process today in the assurance model predominantly only accepts one deviation, and in this case you might get more, and maybe that's makes it unacceptable, right? But it's a dialogue that we're going to end up having with clients, and I think the audit profession needs to be prepared for that, and we're actively talking about it. And then I think the other dialogue that should be happening is getting back to the bigger mission which, as Chris, you mentioned, is how should the audit product, evolve? And if we are deploying new technologies to be able to execute audits and faster with a higher quality, focusing on more things, what does the public and what do stakeholders need out of the audit product? Today, the audit product is predominantly an annual, in arrears kind of product, and we should be having some kind of discussion about where that product should evolve to in the future. Because what we see with technology innovation predominantly is not rapid cost movement. It's in product improvement, and that holds true across all industries. And so I think this industry is no different, and we should really be looking at that.
So if
Tracy,
you
do you
were
think-
to, I'm sorry.
Sorry, do you
Go ahead,
think we
Emmy.
should maybe open it up for questions? I'm kind of worried that we're going to run out of time. I know this is such a hot topic, so I don't know if you
Absolutely.
have-
I think
okay,
Gina
sorry.
Sanchez has a question.
Thank you. Hello everyone, and thank you. As some of you know, but the panelists may not, I also run a machine learning platform for investors. And the question that I have is, when I think about the role of the PCAOB and the role of the audit profession with respect to use of various technologies, I bristle at the broad use, by the way, of the term AI, but I specialize in machine learning specifically. But one of the things that I think the PCAOB has to be cognizant of is, first, the use of various technologies for the purposes of making audit recommendations and providing assurance. And the thing that I think we as an organization have to begin to understand is, what is the auditability of that. I agree with Valerie that we can't use this entirely to make our decisions for us, and that auditors, that there will still be a human element to a final decision. And so there's a big difference between a technology-enabled process and a process that overly relies on technology, in which case you have to audit the actual control environment for that technology, which means being able to monitor type 1 errors, where we basically flag a lot of things that turn out to be nothing upon audit, versus a type 2 error where we provide assurance that turns out to be fraud, right? And being able to sort of figure out how, as a governing body, we can start to get a handle on what that looks like with regard to the various processes that are being put into place. The second is how the audit industry evolves in its knowledge of this, to the extent that auditors themselves can evaluate the control processes around various technologies that are used inside of the generation of financial statements, and in particular, the use of forward-looking assumptions, and any kinds of statements. Do those forward-looking assumptions, are they systematically biased? I think we would all suggest that they probably are, but nonetheless, the notion that we may or may not have the potential to evaluate as auditors the sort of use and question the control environment around that use of companies in order to generate their financial statements, upon which we rely to make our assumptions about what is an accurate price that should be paid for a company's equity or for their debt. And so that's obviously not totally exhaustive, but that gives you at least a few layers of the onion that I'm thinking about with my IAG hat on with regard to the PCAOB. I agree. I understand, Chris, your sort of desire to support innovation, and I completely agree with it. But I do think that we do have to run sort of parallel study as we figure out how do we set up the guardrails for ensuring that we don't end up will end up creating an environment that causes over-reliance such that we get too many type 2 errors systematically as an industry.
That's a good point, Gina. And also, Hamish, you've got a question in the chat. Can you explain the systemic audit risks currently unknown but discoverable by AI on which PCAOB could be taking action?
Sure. I hinted at this a little bit in the material that I sent through prior to this meeting. So our system's obviously identifying accounting manipulation at the individual stock level and the extent of it. But clearly, once you start aggregating that up, you start to get actual system-wide signals. And so, for example, we can literally see how does the US stack up against other countries in terms of the extent of manipulation. Within the US, we can start zooming in on sectors, industries, certain types of companies. And I mentioned before, we can, right at in my opening comments, we can zoom in even on individual auditors. And what you find is there are concentrations of risk. To grossly simplify, for example, US listed companies, a disproportionate percentage of high manipulation risk US companies are incorporated in the Caymans. As one example, that's a one that I just threw in there into the supporting material. But there's a lot of these signals that can be derived. We have these automated reporting systems that generate these and can actually identify where you have these concentrations of risk that are obviously absolutely critical to address.
And are any of those public, Hamish?
So our system at the moment is constrained to publicly available companies. We are currently working on a system that will extend to private companies so that the end user will be able to inject their own data and be able to get signals out.
I mean, the outcome of, I saw that you'd done it by, Western Europe and regions and the States and all the rest of it, but is some of that more a more detailed data at all public?
No, but we are very happy to provide that to the PCAOB and to the Investment Advisory Group. We can provide you with some summary information that will provide you with a lot more clarity on where those exposures are. Happy to do that.
Likewise, any.
That'd be fascinating. Thank you.
So one of the areas we did touch on a little bit was enterprise risk management and how AI is helping companies understand kind of what their risk appetite is and what their potential opportunities or problems are going to be. Will, you had mentioned that would be an excellent way to start initially thinking about using AI in organizations.
Yeah, I think that, the case that's been laid out here in a couple of different ways of, looking at external data sources and using those external data sources and synthesizing risks is a good use case, in particular because when you do that, you start with good data sets. And the problem that we talked about earlier about consolidating data sets and consolidating systems and legacy systems and some of those challenges go away if you start with an external data set that's uniform and consistent, and then use that to synthesize into risks.
So how do you all feel about disclosure of the use of AI to outside parties if your organizations are using these types of models? I'd like to hear from everybody on that one. Do you disclose it? Do you not disclose it? I'll start with you, Chris.
Everyone is already using it.
Right, but yeah. I'm saying specifically as it relates like in an audit situation or in an investment situation.
I assume that many auditors use auto suggest in their emails in an audit situation, or use spell check in a audit situation. I would assume most auditors, I know auditors are using OCR, optical character recognition, when they convert a PDF to text. So spell check, auto suggest, it's the same technology, right? And it's really tough to draw a line. We won't use AI means we won't use Microsoft, right?
But I'm talking about more
Yeah.
large language models that you're used to come to decisions.
Yeah, sure. But so to come to a decision, I mean, you are using a large language model to come to a decision in that instance, which is how to finish the sentence, which is very similar. And when you're saying, okay, Deloitte can't implement a model, it means they can't build, like they, instead of using Adobe PDF's OCR recognition, they can't implement an alternative internally. I think like you're saying, what if you're implementing it internally rather than using an outside tool that has AI as a component? I mean, I think you could say the only way you could disclose whether or not you're using AI, given that it's, I mean, to Gina's point, what is it? The only way you could disclose it is if you were disclosing the use of chatbots specifically.
Valerie?
Yeah, I think you know I'm all in favor of full transparency when it comes to AI, and I take your point that you know we're using it to complete the sentence and check the grammar, but this is very different from using it more substantively, right? To kind of reach the decision. I mean, we are not using it to make decisions yet, but we're kind of moving there quite quickly. Like for instance, I have a research paper where we take financial statements and use language models to analyze them, right? Numbers in financial statements, perform financial statement analysis, and it gives us actually very good recommendation in terms of whether the company is going to kind of improve or deteriorate going forward, right? So based on that, I can give investment advice. But you know, if I was to give this to someone and it's primarily based on AI, and it actually tells me why the company is going to go up or down, I want to know, right? I mean, this is a much more substantive, essentially close to AI making a decision or whether to invest in a company or not, right? So these types of instances, I think it's very important to allow the user to understand where it's coming from so that they can do additional due diligence if they feel like that's necessary.
Okay. Ed, and then we're going to go to John Grable, his question.
Yeah, I thought it might be useful to talk about what companies are doing around governance of AI, and you know, almost all companies have an AI governance committee to look at how AI is being used internally, and also model review management. So this applies in financial institutions and many companies across sectors to really kind of assess and advance the use of AI, how it's being used, is it fair and equitable, et cetera. Are the, you know, what bias might be there from the data sets. So it's very detailed reviews of models and where they're being deployed as part of a review and an approval process to get, you know, AI systems deployed. So so I think those committees are either in place or being put in place, and models are being reviewed, and so all of this you know, should and can be transparent to both within the company as well as outside.
Thanks, Ed. Paul, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Actually, a comment and a question. We spoke earlier about sort of data collection initiatives on the part of PCAOB, and clearly surveying the accounting industry about how they use AI would be a great idea. And obviously you can't just say, do you use AI? You have to ask about it. I mean, putting the survey together would be a non-trivial, but I think very useful exercise. But also a question for the panel. I mean, the bad guys use AI too, right? I can use spectacles to defeat facial recognition. So how do we is there an arms race potentially going on to hide bad practices or to defeat AI-driven screens, and how can we be confident, or how do we manage that arms race? Because I'm sure it's going to happen.
Hamish, you want to take that?
Yeah, if I can jump in there, I think the short answer, Paul, is yes. Yes, there is an arms race. No question. There's some competition in this space. One of the pluses is that machine learning AI systems, of course, by their very nature, are highly dynamic and can adapt to new data very, very quickly and adjust and therefore compete. So unlike your old world 20 accounting ratios, fixed levels, fixed direction they work, enough of those, you get bad marks, you investigate, or whatever it may be, you've got something that can learn in real time, whether it be via the accounting data, from my perspective, whether it be from text analysis from Chris's perspective, etc., to actually try and defeat those. Having said that also, it is at this stage still, we believe, quite complicated for someone to, for example, actually employ machine learning to manipulate their accounts in a way that cannot be identified by other forms of machine learning. And this is not the forum to go into that in more detail, but it is challenging. But I think yes, the short answer is there is an element of an arms race here.
Just one quick follow-up to that. As far as I know, the implementation and integration on the corporate side, looking forward to AI written 10Ks. I can't get worse, can they? No, that's somewhat tongue in cheek. But my impression is that adoption is actually quite slow, unless anyone has a different take.
We have a question from John.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. The question relates to the integrity of the large language models. It's one thing if the model ingests a public database like Edgar, takes all that information. It's different if the model is built using confidential information, proprietary information, audit work papers prepared by client documents. Are we then potentially entering a realm where the inputs are tainted and there are challenges with how we then use the model to draw conclusions if it's based upon, in this case, it's not copyrighted, but effectively copyrighted information?
Who wants to take that?
I mean, I can maybe start. I think, models can be trained on different domains, right? And so, I mean, the way it typically started the machine learning, right, is that, right? So it's kind of useful to distinguish between kind of narrow AI and broad or general AI. And we are kind of on the path to general AI, but pretty still far away. But the large language models, the AI actually have this element that's quite general. Anyway, so narrow models, they actually often very powerful, but for very, very specific task, right? They are trained specific for their task and they can do magical things much better than humans. But, general models, the thing is that they are not trained for a particular task, that they can kind of do many tasks, like it can write an essay and it was not specifically trained to write an essay on this topic, right? You give it a prompt and it will do it. But more specifically to your question, when it comes to large language models, we are kind of moving towards this general model that is not really domain specific, right? So you don't really need to train it on financial documents for it to be useful, or on medical documents to be useful. Model can always be fine-tuned on these documents to kind of get a little bit more power out of it, but overall, at this point, these models are so good that there's value in doing that is not very much. But then, the question is, if you train it on some proprietary data, can the model kind of learn some of this proprietary information? Yes, of course, that's the case. And this is where ethical considerations are going to kick in, right? If I ask the ChatGPT to generate an image that looks like, some artist that I like, that's going to be an issue. It will generate that image but yeah, so anyway, I mean, let me stop here.
Okay, Will?
Yeah, I think what Valerie was also alluding to there is the training of GPT-4. I don't know that we know the exact numbers now. I can't recall if it's been disclosed, but we think was on, about 1 trillion documents. So even if you take all the audit working papers that we have access to as a firm, it's a bit like, dumping a bottle of water into the ocean. It just isn't enough to do much in terms of training a new model. So these models are already so large. There is plenty of application to be found in just the GPT. Now, there is already the litigation ongoing around those models. So, this isn't the place to debate that part, but I think that what you'll see first is a big push towards adoption of the GPT pre-trained, models.
Yep.
Ed?
Yeah, I was going to comment on the copyright issue is a real issue, and so that is real. There are ways to use these large language models where you're using them to interpret questions, and then when it generates information, it's basically again from specific sources where you have either paid for the content or have access to the content, and so you're not necessarily using it to generate information off of copyrighted information. So I'll leave it there, but it's
Okay.
a real problem.
Chris, final comment before we move on to Sandra and Lynn?
No, I just wanted to make the point that just even with a fine-tuned model, a pre-trained model, generally how they become very powerful is doing fine-tuning on top of it or continual pre-training, which will and can mean that private information is regurgitated, and that is a very real risk. And if you are doing internal training, you need to be making sure that no private or copyrighted data is going into that model. And I also just wanted to say that our CTO, that's not his current role right now, but he does specialize in privacy as it relates to language models. So if you'd like a more in-depth discussion around enforcing privacy, I'd be more than happy to make that introduction.
Thank you. Sandra?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have sort of a comment, and embedded in it is several questions. So I was a part of the PCAOB's technology task force pre-COVID, a couple of years before COVID, right? And it seems like we're still having the same discussion that we had at that time, right? The firms are using AI in a way that they don't necessarily communicate to investors, right? Because they're proprietary uses of that technology. We're very worried about the use of AI and it being a bad decision maker, but auditors are bad decision makers. Humans are bad decision makers, right? So are these making us better or worse or the same, right? So there's all this concern about, is it good? Is it predictive? Is it efficiently predictive? And what Hamish is telling us is, well, the auditors aren't so good at it either. At least one of them. I'm being cheeky intentionally, right? But we don't see how audits are carried out right now. So as the investor advisory group, we're trying to take this in and say, what should we do with this, or what should we advise it? But we're still in an audit world where we have a lack of transparency. And as investors, I'm curious from Hamish, if you see companies and you can predict they're going to have a problem, but what about companies that go bust that you didn't see, right? Those are interesting to me as well. But always missing from this conversation is that Will, as an auditor, is using a different data set, which is part of what Paul was saying, than is Chris and Hamish, right? You're using 10Ks. He's using the ledger or other tools that help him, right? But missing from the conversation is the person who's the arbiter of the information that's shared between the two, which is the FASB, right? And as I experience it, at least in the US, the IASB internationally, as I experience it, no more information can possibly be provided because it's all too expensive to provide, but everybody's using AI. So it's very, as an investor who's advocating for information that you don't necessarily have to use AI models to detect malfeasance or fraud or whatever you want to call it, it always seems that missing in the conversation is the people who arbitrate what goes from the ledger to the 10K, right? And that organization doesn't have a technology task force, doesn't have a conversation with auditors and investors about technology. And it's something to me that we need to have as investors to be able to sort of say, what do we do with this information, right? And so I would put that out there because I don't feel like we're making progress on what we should do in this, because we can't necessarily see it. I'm worried personally, as someone who advocates for information, that we're going to have a lot of language models that can create 10Ks, and we're going to have boilerplate language that becomes more boilerplate, right? Because everybody's going to copy what the other person said, whether that's relevant to them or not, right? And I actually feel like AI, because 10 years ago, investors were hearing investors are overloaded with information. They can't possibly consume all this, right? And it was a reason not to disclose anything. Now it's just don't talk about technology, right? But it's obviously being used. So the challenge we have as an organization, my organization, I work for CFA Institute, for those who may not know, is where's our advocacy efforts? Because we can't seem to break the ledger to the 10K battle. And the PCAOB's data set is actually different than the auditors, right? Their data set is the audit work papers, right? So we're all dealing with different data sets, and it's just really challenging to know what we should do with this because we can't necessarily see it, right? So I'm curious about whether people believe it's going to actually increase the information that investors get. Is it going to be more boilerplate? Is it going to be more useful? I'm curious as to what you guys think.
Well, let me start maybe by saying I think the amount of information is going to be controlled by basically FASB and the Securities and Exchange Commission, right? What I think AI is going to be very helpful is in kind of distilling this information and making it much more accessible. I mean, the issue of overload that you bring up is a very old issue, and like for past 30 years, we hear that there's information overload. In fact, FASB considered having summaries, I think in 1990s, right? And then they abandoned this idea because they thought summaries are going to be kind of manipulated and too vague and it will not convey kind of the substance very well, right? Because companies will kind of spin them, right? But with AI, this is not an issue. AI gives you a very good, and I've done quite some work on summaries. They are very informative and very relevant. Somehow it just gets what information to include, and that information is kind of the most useful one. And it serves as a great starting point. So I think it will help. And it's very good at eliminating boilerplate and stuff like that. So yeah, there may be more boilerplate going forward, but AI has no problem kind of parsing through that. And so that, I would start here.
Hamish?
If I could just, add something quickly to that. I think they're fantastic points, Sandra, really interesting ones, particularly the issue you raise of LLMs ultimately resulting in potentially too much standardization of text, so everything just becomes boilerplate, is a really, really interesting point. But I guess if I was going to step back a bit, I think begin with the issue of this is just such a gigantic problem, this notion of accounting manipulation. So our numbers suggest it was over $1 trillion a year. We recently discovered the SEC believes it's more than $4.7 trillion a year. Independent academic research suggests that 40% of companies in the US manipulate their accounts every single year, and 10% do it to outright securities fraud every single year. So the magnitude of this is staggering, and therefore machine learning tools, AI tools, are of course primed to identify these and well placed to be able to process this data. To your point about whether, for example, a system like mine can it identify what happened with companies that went bust that we didn't see. Our system is designed specifically to focus on this notion of accounting manipulation that leads to corporate failure, or at a minimum is correlated with corporate failure. So companies can go bust for other reasons. It's just a bad company. It may have great accounts, but it's just a bad company. We're not interested in those. We're interested in the really insidious ones that end up with lawsuits flying and lots of reputational damage and expensive costs, et cetera, et cetera. I circulated prior to this meeting not only a PowerPoint presentation but a white paper.
Yeah, I'm going to cut you off. We've got 2 more questions and 5 more minutes. So everybody did receive your information. Can we go to Lynn? And then we'll take George. Lynn Turner, you're on mute.
Yeah, there isn't enough time for my questions, so I'll just say I would echo what Sandy said. I was doing this type of research. I was in senior management of an international semiconductor company. And in reality, this is nothing new. This is more, as I think to use Hamish's term, an evolution of where we were 2 decades ago to where we are today. And computing power has become so much more facilitating in terms of what is able to accomplish that we can move this along. But there's questions that this excellent discussion is teed up but not answered with respect to getting ethical standards set for this. I am very concerned about where this takes us ethically in the long run, and I think those standards need to get established sooner rather than later. I know the technology industry wants everyone to adopt this, but if we adopted it without ethical standards, that could create a real bad situation for us. None of you really mentioned the public sources. You all talk about the general ledger or the the financial statements or whatever. We've been able to analyze those electronically for a long time, but we can do it much more now with the languages that are available and also the computing power. But to really make this work well, and Ed, I like very much your notion about how to do that step at a time and all. I thought that was very wise. But the public sources, there is so much information out in the public sources that none of you got into. How are you accessing the data in those public sources that turn up a lot of these frauds, or the frauds are found in those? And I'd like to hear more about that. I'd like to hear more about the specifics of backtesting and how often and what your actual results have been on backtesting. Hamish, you mentioned 90%, but you really didn't get into the time frame because investors are investing on a daily basis. If it takes us, Jim Chanos came out and said investing in real estate in China was a bad thing, and he was absolutely spot on, but he was like 5 years before his time, and in that 5 years everyone lost their money. So timing is a big thing that we need to talk about. As far as the bad guys, O'Brien was excellent with his comments. Are there bad guys? The bad guys are ahead of the good guys in this industry. The good guys can't get the updates and patches put in fast enough, and the bad guys are just running rampant, and they're all offshore, so we can't do anything about it. And Hamish, you mentioned 1 out of 4 auditors have got your package. That is it's not surprising, but it's stunning in this day and age. And what you didn't answer was, is that package distributed and used by each engagement team worldwide throughout that firm? Because I've dealt with the firms on this in the past, and they typically like to get it in the national office, but not distribute it out to the people who really need it, because that's when the costs go up, because you have to license it out that way, and they dislike that. But we need these packages in the hands of the people who are doing the audits, not the national office and headquarters, but the people in our, how are we going to facilitate getting that done? And then the accuracy of the data. I don't think any of you really answered the question, especially with the generative AI. What are the specific processes that you are doing to ensure the accuracy, including when you start going into the important public sources? How are you going to turn around and do that? And furthermore, how is Will going to get access to people who contested on his staff? Because the students are asking the question, and Ken Goldman teed this up before the meeting. Students aren't going into accounting and auditing now because they listen to a presentation like this. They know the auditing firms aren't paying as much as the engineers, software, electrical. They aren't paying as much as lawyers, doctors, other professions. And they'll sit here and say, I can go to work for Hamish and make more money than I can auditing. And Hamish is going to be around a lot longer than these auditors. Why would I ever go to work for an auditing firm? And this profession and the PCAOB has to address that issue, because that issue is live right now and today. And the auditing firms, although they're all laying off people, they are going to need to hire them sooner or later.
Thank you, Lynn. Can we just hear one last question from George?
Sure.
He's been patient.
Yes. Thank you, Tracy, very much. And Lynn actually just touched on the 2 points I was going to make. It's been a great panel, great discussion. So thank you all. One was just quickly on professional skepticism and how the PCAOB, how auditors should think about professional skepticism as AI continues to advance. Maybe not today, but how that comes into play. And then just second of all, very quickly, and Lynn just touched on, ended on, was I've been thinking as this has been progressing, if I were sitting as a senior in a university in the United States of America today, what I'd be thinking about my career choice if I was majoring in accounting, and how you all think about that, whether I have the right skills, resources are still needed, but it's a different skill set, or it's the same skill set. So I'll leave it there, Tracy. Those are the 2 points I had, but thank you for the panel.
Thank you all for listening and participating. And I want to thank our panelists as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll take it from here. Thank you all so much for such a lively and informative discussion on AI and the impacts to audits and the PCAOB. Tracy, thank you so much for your contributions in organizing and running the panel, and also the members of the IAG who put forward the names of our esteemed panelists. I think that we will be continuing this discussion. Perhaps the IAG will hand this off to a subcommittee for further discussion and hopefully maybe some comments and recommendations that the board might find useful. But thanks again for all those wonderful comments. We really do appreciate all of your time. Hamish in particular, I know it's like 4 o'clock in the morning there, so get some coffee in that bloodstream here shortly. So next up, I would like to introduce Jeff Mahoney, a valued member of the IAG, to kick off a follow-up on a prior topic of interest, critical audit matters, or CAMs. This discussion stems from recommendations that the IAG's subcommittee on standards made back at our October 10th meeting. One of those recommendations relates to investor outreach, which Jeff is going to discuss. Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon. Thought it might be helpful to begin with just some brief background on critical audit matters before discussing the launch of an IAG initiative to improve the quality of those disclosures. So let me start back in 2007. That's when U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry M. Paulson Jr. created an advisory committee whose goal was to examine comprehensively the condition and future of the auditing profession. The advisory committee, which included a philosophically diverse group of investors, business, academic, and institutional leaders, and included IAG members Ken Goldman and Lynn Turner. That advisory committee was co-chaired by former SEC Chairman Arthur J. Levitt Jr. and former SEC Chief Accountant Donald P. Nicolaisen. The advisory committee's work resulted in one of the most significant studies of the U.S. auditing profession ever produced. In October 2008, the advisory committee issued a final report that contained over 30 recommendations. Those recommendations included a recommendation directed to the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, urging the board to undertake a standard-setting initiative to consider improvements to the auditor's standard reporting model that had remained largely unchanged for over 70 years. The basis for that recommendation included the view that improving the content of the auditor's report beyond its traditional pass-fail model would better reflect the amount of work and judgment involved in a financial statement audit and would likely lead to more relevant information for investors and other users of financial statements. So fast forward to June of 2017, after more than 6 years of public due process, including 3 rounds of solicitation of public comment, the PCAOB adopted Auditing Standard 3101 entitled The Auditor's Report on an Audit of Financial Statements when the auditor expresses an unqualified opinion. That standard was largely responsive to the advisory committee recommendation by requiring that an auditor of a public company communicate critical audit matters, or so-called CAMs, in any audit opinion relating to its audit of the company's current period financial statements. And the standard followed a similar standard issued in January 2015 by the International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, ISA 701, entitled Communicating Key Audit Matters in the Independent Auditor's Report. That standard requires disclosure of key audit matters, or so-called KCAMs, by companies and jurisdictions that adopt the IAASB standards. For purposes of the PCAOB's AS 3101, a CAM is defined as a matter arising from the audit of a company's financial statements that, 1, was communicated or required to be communicated to the audit committee, 2, relates to accounts or disclosures that are material to the company's financial statements, and 3, involved especially challenging, subjective, or complex auditor judgment. CAMs are intended to provide tailored information specific to the audit from the auditor's point of view. AS 3101 went into effect for audits of larger public companies 2019 and was required for audits of most other U.S. public companies in 2020. At its June 2023 meeting, the IHE held a session devoted to CAMs, which included an expert panel moderated by IHE's Sandy Peters. The purpose of that meeting and panel was to explore the more than 3 years after the standards required implementation, investor views on CAMs relative to their initial expected potential. The expert panel was comprised of former PCAOB Chief Auditor Martin Baumann, former PCAOB Chief of Staff Samantha Ross, Dr. Colleen Hannesberg of Stanford Law School, and Jared Goodman of the Colorado Public Employees Retirement Association. Following the June meeting, Sandy prepared a draft memorandum for IHE member input that included a summary of the June panel presentation and 7 related IHE recommendations. A majority of IHE members responding to the memorandum approved of the memo's issuance. Sandy Peters presented the approved IHE memorandum and the 7 recommendations at the October 2023 IHE meeting. Of the 7 IHE recommendations, 6 were directed at the PCAOB board or staff. In my view, the most important of those 6 recommendations were the 2 recommendations to amend AS 3101 to 1, revise the especially challenging language used in the standard for identifying potential CAMs. The IHE believes such language may actually be discouraging auditors from issuing potential CAMs that would be useful to investors. At the June IHE meeting, Mr. Baumann indicated that the especially challenging language has been interpreted narrowly by the auditors in a manner that results in a fewer number of CAMs being disclosed than the PCAOB had intended when the standard was originally issued. The second recommended amendment to AS 3101 was to revise the description of how the critical audit matter was addressed in the audit, found in paragraph 14C of the standard. More specifically, the recommended revision would eliminate the optionality that currently permits auditors to omit disclosing two pieces of information about CAMs that are of great interest to many investors and that many auditors have effectively and collectively written out of the standard. That information includes one, an indication of the outcome of the audit procedures performed, and two, key observations with respect to the critical audit matter. I am hopeful that the PCAOB's current research agenda project entitled Communications of Critical Audit Matters will promptly become a standard-setting project and will result in proposed amendments to AS 3101 that address those two recommendations. The seventh recommendation approved by the IHE and presented at the October meeting is an IHE initiative that we are announcing the launch of today. In this initiative, the IHE plans to issue a request seeking nominations from the general public for the most decision-useful critical audit matter or key audit matter contained in public company audit reports in the 2023 Form 10Ks and Form 20Fs. The nominations will be accepted by the IHE through June 30th. Those nominations received will be reviewed and evaluated by the IHE members. The IHE will select what they believe to be the top 3 decision-useful CAMs or key audit matters for 2023 among those nominated by the public. Those CAMs or CAMs selected will be identified and discussed in an IHE-approved report expected to be issued publicly later this year. The objective of this IHE initiative, which we plan to pursue on an annual basis, is to encourage auditors to voluntarily improve the quality of information communicated to investors in the audit opinions of public companies. And this initiative complements IHE's continued support of the other 6 recommendations directed to the PCAOB board and staff. That completes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I see Ken's hand up.
Yeah, a couple. Yeah, actually, I've seen this a lot in practice. The CAMs. I'm gonna make sort of like Lynn. I'm gonna make some comments. I've seen reluctance by the auditing firms, to expand the number. They seem to be very comfortable with 1 or 2. Even if I bring up as an audit committee member that maybe we should look at X, Y, Z, and they sort of look at it and push back. So I wonder. So anyway, I find them very helpful for really having a good discussion at the audit committee meetings, and a good back and forth. I don't know how much, and I think you've done some research on how much the investor. It may be one of the things when the PCAOB does sections of firms that they look and see if certain ones, not in a negative way, but come to look at and question, a challenge, a critique, whatever the word is, whether some CAM should have been noted that weren't noted. So there may be something to add to the inspection report that PCAOB does. And again, I'm not thinking from an enforcement point of view. I'm thinking from a helpful point of view. And it also, as I said earlier, I just repeat myself, I guess, is it would be good to really do a good study to see how investors are using it. I do know myself from an audit committee point of view, I like seeing them. I like discussing which ones they have listed, which ones they haven't listed, and why. So I do find it from an audit committee point of view helpful. But I do think we need more research and work here. I'll stop there.
Okay, in response to that comment, I would just say that of the 7 recommendations, the second recommendation that we made in the October document that Sandy prepared does address your issue about CAMs and inspections.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ken. Are there any additional questions? I see David's hands up.
Yeah, Jeff, a good initiative, which I support, and thank you and Sandy for all the work that you've done on this. But on the other 6 recommendations from the AIG, do we have any sense of sort of the timetable and the response of when they might be done? I mean, my sense is that in making those recommendations, we were saying, if you do this, then your intent when you put the CAMs in the first place will be fulfilled, because it's not being fulfilled now, and that we might therefore have a process that doesn't take too terribly long?
Yeah, if I can answer that question, thank you, David. As you know, it has, the CAMS is on the research agenda, and once that project is completed, we will be sure to share results of the staff's finding.
Any sense of the timing, Saba, of the research, and then presumably there'll be other processes after that?
I will have to get back to you on that question, but it's a good question. Thank you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Lynn?
Yeah, Saba, thank you. I'd say research in Washington, D.C. is dependent upon the outcome every 4 years. So at any rate, I do think that I want to be careful with your comment, Jeff, about the 2 most important. I think all of those things were extremely important, and we shouldn't just do these 2 to the detriment of any of the others. But I think this is important. I would ask, one, that we ask for nominations for the best CAMs and or KCAMs, because I think the best ones typically are KCAMs with the disclosures around those. But also, we should ask for instances where there wasn't a CAM that the public thought there should have been a CAM, to David's point. So give us the best CAMs, and if you didn't see or if you had a best CAM, was there also a situation where you saw there was no CAM that you thought there should have been a CAM? I think that's important and runs to the comment that David just made. And so I'd urge you to do that as well.
Thank you, Lynn. Alicia? You're on mute.
Musing aloud for just a moment, I'm thinking about the whole banking situation issue we had last year, right? With Silicon Valley, etc. Technically, there was no disclosure if you were wading through all of that around the potential risk of a mismatch, given the given the changes in interest rates. And of course, the new information was the fast accelerated exit or consumption on the deposit side of the balance sheet. What I'm wondering about is, in terms of this, what CAM should have been there, is that not going to be hit with the benefit of hindsight?
I mean, I'm not an auditor, Alicia, so it's hard for me to opine on whether or not those should have been declared as CAMs. But as an investor, there are certainly risks that are outlined in the MD&A and knowledge of that, investment book that existed at those banks. And So I don't know what critical assumptions the company or management was making in order to release their financials that would have or should have been released in the CAMs. Certainly there could have been a test of interest rates rising and falling that they could have disclosed. But I don't know if it should have been in CAMs or it could have been, I suppose, but I don't know if it would have been more incumbent upon the investors to understand the balance sheet there and understand the investment book and what might happen if there was a run on the bank such that actually occurred. So I don't know. I just didn't like the silence in the response, no one responding. So that's my 2 cents, but I mean, it's an interesting question.
This is Sandy. Since I worked on the CAM thing and I worked on the CAM thing at the same time I was working on the bank thing, that's a good question, Alicia. And I would tell you that in some instances that would be true, but in the context of that specific example, the really interesting point is that there are many things where the auditors aren't thinking that these are challenging assumptions to make. And so it wasn't the intent, it was the ability. And if you read the Fed report basically says indirectly, if this hadn't have happened now, it would have happened in the next 2 to 3 years because the deposits that came in were going to need to be used to run the business over the next 2 to 3 years. And those assets that were classified as held to maturity were matured at a date after that had occurred, right? They don't address the accounting per se, but if you read between the lines, so my points being that at the time, was there documentation in the work paper that said the ability is a real audit issue that we need to do some basically liquidity or going concern assessment around? Because by the time those financial statements were issued, interest rates were already high. And in fact, that state had existed for say six to 9 months before those financial statements were issued. So that's a good example of one that is really live in, was the decision made at the right time? There are certainly others which occur later. There are some related to segments that we're seeing right now play out. I've always believed that certain items related to segments should be critical audit matters. The auditors don't think about it in the same way that investors think about it. There are tons of allocations. We're seeing that play out and moving of expenses in the context of particular organizations that are currently under SEC scrutiny. So I definitely think that there are things that can be done after, but there's also things that aren't with the benefit of hindsight. They're just clear reflections of a lack of best judgment at the time.
Thanks, Sandy. So, Lynn, I just wanted to clarify one thing. CAMS is on the research agenda, and it's normally for 12 months, not eternity, since we put it on the agenda just a few months ago. So we have a couple of more months to go, but it is going to be, we're not going to take more than 12 months. So I just wanted to clarify that. I don't see any additional hands up. Lynn, did you have a follow-up question, or this is
just I'd echo what Sandy said with respect to the 4 banks. It wasn't just Silicon Valley, it was 4 banks. And there was a Fed examination. We don't know if or if not, and if not, why not, KPMG didn't obtain or get the examination report from the federal examiners out of San Francisco. And certainly there was some incredibly useful information in that with respect to the risk that this entity was undertaking. It was known by the time of the audit report that the credit risk executive had left earlier in the prior year. It was also known that they'd had 10% of their deposits roll off before the end of the year, before the end of 22. And it was also known that there was a large group of uninsured deposits. And in fact, I think today it's something like 30 to 40% of all deposits of banks are uninsured, which means they're running a incredibly high risk if a problem develops, if they have to raise capital. And it was known before the audit report that this bank was going to have to go raise capital. All of those things were known. So I don't think it's a matter of hindsight, but to the discussion by the director of inspection earlier, 40% of these inspections that are being done under the leadership of Erica Williams, thank goodness, they're finding that 40% of the inspections they looked at hadn't obtained the evidence to support the opinion, and therefore the opinion never should have been issued. So this is not, I don't think this is a hindsight issue. There could be other things surrounding it in terms of what was or was not provided to the auditors, but it's not necessarily a hindsight issue. I think that's wrong.
Thank you, Lynn. And this has been a great, great discussion. So we're getting close to time. Thank you everyone for your time. I hope you found today's meeting rewarding and worth your time. Please note that the next IAG meeting will be in person in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, September 26th. There will be a reception the night before, and we'll provide additional details as we get closer to the event. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Saba?
Yes.
One quick question. So is the IAG going to send out that request for nominations?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.